listeners. Welcome back. We have an exciting guest this week, Emily Kasriel. And Emily is an author of the book Deep Listening: Transform Your Relationships with Family, Friends, and Foes. I love that. And is also the Senior Visiting Research Fellow at King's College in London. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you so much, Julie. Great to be here with you.
Well, tell me about the book. There's so much. I always kind of grimace when like people are like, you need to listen better as a leader, but it's way more complicated than that because we're not great listeners. We tend to overestimate that about ourselves. So I'm so curious what led you to your research for your book, and get us in on some tools and tips that can be helpful for folks that want to get better at deep listening.
That sounds fantastic. Well, I have been an executive coach on the side in my role at the BBC and also an accredited mediator, workplace mediator. And I was running a really big season across the whole of the BBC called Crossing Divide, stories about people engaging across difference rather than the usual conflict stories we so like to tell in the news of people, whatever, whether it's race, class, religion, age, and politics, we like to tell stories of conflict. So in doing so, I had to brief like 40 local radio producers, all searching for conflicts in their own town and finding ways of gathering two people across that divide. And I realized I needed to know more. How can we have really great conversations even when we disagree, perhaps fiercely disagree? So I started doing more research. And then in 2022, we did a big project for the BBC Centenary and the British Council in which we recruited 1,000 people in 100 countries. And I trained them over 3 weeks virtually. And I should say this was a disparate band of people. The biggest countries represented were New Zealand, UK, Malaysia, and Iran. I have a
Wow.
mate of mine who runs the BBC Persian service, so we recruited quite a lot of people via Telegram. So we had people from really different backgrounds, but after training them in deep listening, and a paper's just been published in the Journal of Applied Social Psychology, your very well-known bedtime read, not like academic article, but it does demonstrate that when people feel deeply listened to, they become more open, more connected, and more able to re-examine their own attitudes. And that's why deep listening is so exciting because it gives people the understanding and the lived experience that they are not contaminated when they listen to somebody with different views, if they listen with real curiosity and a desire to understand.
I know. That is fascinating though, because if you can channel a time when you felt really listened to, especially by somebody who might have very different beliefs than you're more likely to reciprocate that in the conversation too and listen back to them. So I'm curious with deep listening, what is deep? How would you describe deep listening, Emily? And how is it different than just regular active listening?
Well, so often when we listen, it's performative. What we're doing, to quote this writer, Jacqueline Bussey, we're reloading our verbal gun with ammunition, ready to fire. We go through the motions of listening. We say, yeah, yeah, I understand. I got it. Yeah, I get it. Yeah, completely right. We're not actually open. We're not in a state of presence. We haven't listened to ourselves first to realize our own skin in the game. In fact, I might be listening to you, Julie, but I'm not really listening to you. I'm listening to my elder sister who I feel frustrated about. And therefore, awareness of our shadows, what's going on for us, being able to be really present. And this is for conversations that really matter, not just for like, would you like some tea? For the conversations that matter, and particularly when we disagree, allows us to tune in at a really much deeper level to what the person is saying and what they're not saying, and critically what they're feeling. And so rather than just try and kind of parrot back what they've said, we use our what Theodore Reich, who was a pupil of Sigmund Freud, called our third ear, to tap into our unconscious to really sense what's going on for the speaker and then crystallize these feelings, even what you just said just now, or your meta feelings of what you've said over the whole conversation or many conversations, and offer that back with humility to the speaker so that they can say, yeah, and you know you haven't quite got it. Or they say, yeah, exactly. And if even if they do say yeah or no, not really, that allows them to then reframe and go deeper so they understand themselves more fully. You understand them. And importantly, you feel far more connected. I can give you
Hmm.
a demonstration if you want.
Oh, I would love that.
Okay, so let me ask you, Julie, and I say I don't know anything about you, but I'm going to ask you live here on your podcast, what food reminds you of home?
Mm. Oh my gosh. My mom used to always make like these stews on Sundays. So something in a crock pot that had meat and potatoes and probably carrots.
So I'm hearing you as you're talking, transported back to Sundays with your mum in a crock pot with meat and carrots and probably potatoes, and a sense that that brings you a connection, even thinking about it. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It was a good childhood memory.
So it was something from when you were younger and it brings you back, and it was really positive for you to think about that. And even now,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's something I like to do with my family too. So a tradition that you can continue.
and so it's not just in the past, it's this sense of continuity that when you provide for your family something similar, you are connecting to your past and your, family, perhaps kids, and the future. And that sense gives you a grounding.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I think it gives you like that warm, fuzzy feeling you had as a kid when, you're doing something that feels familiar and is nourishing and is like you said, a shared experience with somebody that you love.
So it's not just the food, it's that sense of connection with people you love and that warm, fuzzy feeling of
Hmm.
connection that you still have.
Hmm. Yeah. And that you want to recreate to some degree, a kind of bridge to past good memories.
Yeah. So we'll end it there. But how did that feel like that little miniature conversation, Julie?
Oh, yeah. No, I can definitely see like well, just like you said, you're really attempting to be curious about the experience and get deeper than just the superficial, what people say and parrot back. We hear all active listening. Oh, well, repeat what people said or paraphrase what people said. But what you did was really different than that, right? You kind of like took it like an iceberg, saw the first thing and then dug deeper with your series of questions afterwards.
And how many questions roughly did I ask? Just
I think
roughly.
four or five.
Yeah, I only asked one question. What I
Um,
did, you see, if it was me just asking questions, hey, I'm a journalist, I would have said to you, what is a crock pot? I don't have a clue what a crock pot is. I'm like thinking of croc shoes that you wear. I haven't got a clue. Is it rubbery? Haven't got a clue, but I didn't go down there. I
right.
instead stayed with where you wanted to go and tried to
Mm,
reflect back your thoughts, your emotions, and what was underlying them, but with hesitancy to allow you to imagine, because I had a sense that you were thinking as you were speaking. Because so often, especially in America, actually, people are brilliant at like doing vox pops. We said the BBC, best places in the world, Nigeria and America. Ready-made sound bites, offering it to you on a plate, no problem. But these are superficial. We speak at the surface of ourselves. We don't actually think and say what you really mean. So, for example, in a work context, we kind of perform the act of speaking because we're not really being heard. We don't really say what's important to us. And therefore, the listener leaves that conversation none the wiser.
yeah, yeah. I appreciate that. Thanks for your vulnerability in demoing that live. As an experienced trainer, I'm sure that was not your first um, demonstration, but I think it's really helpful to show people what it looks like, right? Rather than kind of the talking points, the things to say, the things to ask. Emily, I'm curious from your vantage point on listening. We've talked about what people get wrong a little bit when they think they're listening. But what do you think the best listeners do? Like when you're teaching these sessions and guiding people through this deep listening process, like what are the things, the skills or the behaviors that really stand out to you with effective deep listening?
I think, firstly, is understanding, and here I'm thinking as I'm speaking rather than just parroting to you, but the understanding that they don't already know what the
Mhm.
speaker is going to say, because so often, particularly if we're boss, for example, and we're talking to our team, we kind of know we're supposed to listen and we go through the motions, but we aren't really curious. So that curiosity is super important. And then being able to leave some silence. I was training a group of Hollywood execs and they said, we don't do silence. They're coming up with witty retorts. They don't have time for that sort of thing. But in not allowing somebody the space to unpack complicated and nuanced ideas, we are just coming up, leaving with a simplified picture. So I think silence, giving even a few seconds of space, can be really, really transformative in changing a relationship, particularly a power dynamic relationship.
Oh yeah. Yeah, especially if there's power at play. I often joke in workshops that I do on allyship and inclusive leadership. Wait that 7, 10 seconds and something beautiful happens on the other side of it. But people get so awkward and uncomfortable. And I kind of knew what you were doing with the silence that you were creating. Like, should I be saying more? Should I be filling this silence? We have a tendency to just feel so awkward even after a couple seconds. But if you can just kind of get used to that slower pace, and it's not really slower pace, but it's just, like you said, creating that space. The more you model it, it becomes much more routine. But I think the first
Yeah.
few tries, it's a little
Yeah, I
clunky.
think you're absolutely right. And in fact, in my book, I illustrate my book, which is quite fun. It's what you can do actually when you write a book. You can do what you like, which is really, really fun. So I said, I want my pictures. But I've got a picture, here we go, of the 9 types of silence by
Um,
the poet Paul Goodman, talking about the dumb silence of slumber or apathy, the sober silence that goes with a solemn animal face, the fertile silence of awareness, and so on. And there's so many different types of silence. And it's like when people fear silence, they often fear these very negative ideas of silence. Whereas in fact, there's a paper that came out in 2021 called Silence is Golden, which showed in negotiations when both sides were invited to be more silent, they came up with many, many more win-win
mm,
ideas rather than zero sum. If I win, you lose. Because silence gives us the space to kind of calm down, to feel less defensive and be more creative. And that's really exciting because when we listen to somebody, we want them not only not to feel judged and to feel respected and that we are curious, but also for them to feel creative, that they can try and test out new ideas that they've not yet had and haven't yet had the space to form. Imagine what a beautiful gift you can give to people in your team if you can provide to them that sort of listening space.
oh, yeah, it's just such a rare gift that you can provide, especially as a leader, to create that space and getting just more comfortable with silence. And one of the things I remember, one of the mantras that helps me to create silence is remembering when I listen, I learn something new. But when I'm
Mm.
speaking, I'm only hearing what I'm already thinking or what I already think I know. And so, wouldn't I want to be curious and listen so that because learning is something that's really important to me. And so that helps me kind of get the right mindset around it. Emily, what would you offer for kind of mindset prep for a more curious conversation?
I think what you've just said is really, really beautiful. And by the way, in my book, when I interviewed Mariana Iskander, who runs Wikipedia, what she says to help her with silence is she has a glass of water and she just goes up and has a drink, which gives her that space to calm down and to listen. What you said about learning something new and maybe even learning about something that challenges you, learning about what could you learn that's unexpected is another invitation that can help put you in a different frame. And that degree of self-awareness, which is why it's so important to listen to yourself first, in order that you can become aware when you are judging. Because so often we judge, we're primed to judge, otherwise we couldn't tell friend from foe. It would be dangerous. We do it automatically, like in a snap, as soon as we see somebody in microseconds. But by being aware of those judgments, particularly if the person looks, sounds, or comes from a different background to us, can enable us to put those judgments gently aside and not judge ourselves for judging, but just return once again to presence and openness to whatever is about to unfold.
Hmm. Yeah, that's the trick you mentioned earlier. Like that's something I do a lot is like grab that glass of water, look out the window, find something to distract myself to be in that mindset and to show that I want to be curious to the other person. Because just because I've asked the question or made a comment, this might be the first time they've been asked something like that, or the first time that someone's made a comment like that. So they don't have a prepared response. They need time to come up with their own thought for me to even be able to listen. So, so interesting. Emily, I'm
Yeah, but they're
curious.
also, no, sorry, go on. I was
What?
just sorry to interrupt. With the Zoom, they got this latency on, which is hard to know quite. And interrupting is, of course, the opposite of giving silence. So I'm very apologetic. I did used to be a serial interrupter, but here I'm blaming the latency um, of interrupting. And oops, I've lost my thought. So sorry, you can cut that bit out. You continue where
Yeah,
you were.
that's okay. No, interruptions, I think modeling that we can, but we can make mistakes. So not that that was a big mistake by any means, Emily, you did not offend me, but the I think the cadence, knowing when to jump in sometimes. And yeah, I often with interruptions, it's just like, okay, I did that. Like, I'm sorry. And like, just conversation continues. So I appreciate you modeling that. We're not always perfect ourselves. What I was curious about with what you were sharing, and feel free if the thoughts return to you to re-explore that, but just because you have the word faux in your book title, I'm so curious because I think that's where everyone's at right now. Like, oh, this is great, but like, how do I talk to somebody that's like completely on the other side of politics, religion, insert, disagreeable argument? And so, what are your recommendations for those faux conversations?
Well, first of all, being aware if we're classifying somebody as a foe when it might be just one attribute that we disagree with, because all the research evidence is like in the US that if you are a Republican, you will see Democrats with a whole array of sensibilities and beliefs, which might be very different from what they actually are. We all have many, many different identities and we don't fall into one hole. One really good question to ask someone who we know thinks very differently or is a member of a different political party than the one we support is to ask them what in your life experience has led you to feel what you do. Because once they explain the origins of their ideas, it can be much easier for us to connect to them. And it might make sense, even if we still disagree. I think it is
Yeah.
so important to understand that by listening, we are not signaling agreement. Many people in the US, we did a research with More in Common, fear that by listening, we signal agreement, and double the number of Gen Z people feel this. And so we avoid listening to people. We think that it's not safe. We think that our words will be misconstrued as support for them. And in doing so, we just create more division and it's more of a channel to social cohesion. And just to return to the point that I was trying to make earlier, which is when we listen in this way, particularly in a work context, people may share more than they were originally intending to. And I think it's really important as a manager in particular to be aware of the ethical implications of listening in this way. I've got a whole chapter in the book about this, about, being able to say to somebody, oh, wait a minute, you sure you want to share more here? Or be clear about where the information will be used or whether it's confidential, and just being open and transparent and being aware that the person might have shared something very confidential or very private and treat it with that type of respect. I think that's super important.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the idea that listening doesn't signal agreement and that you're not encouraging that belief. And just again, like what I'm taking from this conversation is just that space making, how to make that space for these different contentious, not contentious, but like you said, just because somebody has one belief doesn't mean the whole set of beliefs is one way too. And one of the tips I've tried to use, I've borrowed from practitioners over the years in my space is if I get into one of those kind of conversations and it's a messier conversation with a, perhaps faux type of dynamic, and just to say, like, I used to think that too, or here's something that shifted for me too.
Mm.
But I love that question of getting to the origin of somebody's belief or thinking process because it humanizes them, it humanizes the context that they're bringing to that issue rather than that polarization we tend to think of. I disagree, binary, I disagree or I don't, because almost always when you get into those messier conversations, there's a lot we agree with and still things we disagree with, right? But it's much more nuanced than this binary right, wrong, agree, disagree.
Yeah, you're completely right because we tend to put people in boxes. It's like we go around an art gallery and we say, yeah, that's Impressionism or that's modernism, but we're not really looking at the paintings and allowing us to see the full complexity of personhood, their emotions, their values, their upbringing, allows us to connect as a human being with them because we are fellow humans. And it feels so exciting when you can connect with strangers and you can connect with differences across difference. And the research again evidences that when we do reach out to strangers, even though we think it will be frightening or will be rejected, you know, the great majority of time, we feel uplifted by that connection. And it feels like, wow, I can connect with this person, even though they come from a completely different state and look so different to me. And that can feel really empowering and exciting. I spent a couple of days, I was in DC working with the Atlantic Council. And so I went to spend 2 days queuing up with Trump supporters going into the Capital One arena. And I'm not personally a big Trump fan, but I really wanted to listen and understand why they felt the way they did. And these were all people who were like total Trump fans. They'd traveled from Nebraska and Florida and all across the US with scarves and hats and a matter of regalia. And one of them said to me, and we shared the subway ride for half an hour together. And she said, I could sense from some of the things that you said that you weren't a strong Trump supporter, but I did feel you were really curious. And I felt really listened to and heard. And
Mhm.
I think the ability to be able to make people who have perhaps felt disenfranchised and not heard to be heard is something personally that we can all do to all sorts of people in society and to do something about combating the loneliness that so many of us feel who don't even end up talking to a real human being. And instead they, especially, young people sharing their thoughts on, with an LLM rather than a human.
No, I know they use the chat bot therapy. It's just like so interesting to me. But you're right. I mean, there's the opportunity to kind of bridge and let someone be heard, even in the most contentious situations. That sounds fascinating, by the way. I think we could have a whole nother podcast episode on that work that you did in DC. I had something on a micro level happen in my local community with the school board election. And I, kind of put myself out there and said, hey, I'd love to hear about your platform. And at the end of the 20 minutes, I got a lot of information. A lot of it I didn't agree with, but they felt really heard and validated. And then I said, hey, would you mind if I shared, my platform? And, went on a little bit. And then at the end of the conversation, he kind of took a step back and he's like, I've never met someone like you. This is very interesting, right? And I was like, no one changed their minds that day. That wasn't the goal. But we saw each other's humanity. We saw, like, we heard the different perspectives instead of like hunkering down and wanting to isolate, like you said, like, which hurts everyone.
Yeah, it sounds so exciting that you let go of trying to change their mind because that's one of the things that can be so empowering. Because so often when we listen, we only do it to get that ammunition so that we can, distill our arguments and come up with superior wisdom why they should believe what we do. And of course, in those situations, they don't feel heard. We're more like a debating champion rather than somebody who is curious and wants to connect and understand them more deeply.
Ah, bravo. Well said. Well, Emily, your work is so important. Thank you for your book, your gift of teaching. Tell our listeners how can they get a copy of your book and follow your work more?
Fantastic. Well, they can pre-order it on in any bookshop. It's available in the US coming out on June 24. And they can also follow me on LinkedIn or read more about work and other things I've published on deep listening on my website, emilykasriel.com.
Awesome. Thank you for your work. It's such a gift.
Yeah, such a pleasure to talk to you, Julie. Thank you so very much.